Ted Cruz walked onto that live TV set expecting a familiar script. Interrupt, condescend, dominate the frame, and walk away with another clipped soundbite for his base. He thought Jasmine Crockett would fold under the weight of his reputation, his Senate title, and the studio lights. Instead, something very different happened. What began as a calculated attack turned into a slow-motion unraveling, broadcast in real time. The confidence slipped, the smirk faded, and with every sentence, Cruz stepped deeper into a trap he didn't even realize had been set. By the time it ended, the power dynamic had completely flipped, and viewers knew they just witnessed something he couldn't spin his way out of. Ted Cruz opened the segment with the posture of someone who believed the outcome was already decided. His cadence, his phrasing, even the timing of his pauses suggested preparation rather than engagement. This was not a discussion unfolding in real time. It was a performance built around preloaded talking points and familiar lines of attack. He framed his opening remarks to sound authoritative, relying on his Senate title and years of media repetition to establish dominance before Crockett could even fully respond. The approach assumed compliance, that she would react predictably, defend herself narrowly, and allow him to steer the exchange wherever he wanted. Every sentence was delivered as if it were part of a closing argument rather than the beginning of a dialogue. His eyes tracked the camera more than his counterpart, signaling that the real audience he was addressing wasn't in the room but at home. The confidence wasn't conversational. It was procedural. He spoke over transitions, rushed setup questions, and tried to lock the discussion into a rigid framework where he controlled definitions, tone, and tempo. That rigidity mattered because it left no room for adaptation. Cruz wasn't listening for openings or adjusting to responses. He was waiting for his turn to deploy the next line. And the moment the exchange deviated from his script, the imbalance between preparation and presence began to surface. Jasmine Crockett immediately disrupted the expected rhythm by declining to react the way Cruz clearly anticipated. There was no visible irritation, no defensive posture, and no attempt to match his aggression. Instead, she listened carefully, allowing his statements to land without interruption. That restraint changed the emotional temperature of the exchange. Where Cruz's delivery was sharp and confrontational, hers was controlled and deliberate, creating a contrast that drew attention away from his points and toward his tone. By not taking the bait, she denied him the conflict he needed to justify his approach. Each pause was intentional, each response framed to address substance rather than provocation. She didn't rush to correct him, which made her eventual responses feel considered rather than reactive. This composure forced viewers to reassess who held authority in the moment. Rather than appearing overpowered, she seemed anchored, as if she were setting the pace from underneath the surface. Cruz continued to press, but without emotional feedback, his pressure had nowhere to go. The absence of escalation became its own statement. Her calm wasn't passive. It was strategic. By refusing to mirror his hostility, she exposed it. The longer she maintained that discipline, the more his aggression stood alone, detached from any corresponding reaction. In a format built on sparks and clashes, her refusal to ignite anything fundamentally altered the trajectory of the exchange. The first interruption came quickly, almost reflexively, as if Cruz were following muscle memory rather than responding to the moment in front of him. He cut across Crockett mid-thought, inserting his own framing before she could complete a sentence. In most televised exchanges, that move functions as a power grab, signaling control and forcing the other speaker into a defensive posture. This time, however, the interruption landed differently. Crockett did not rush to reclaim the floor or escalate her tone. She stopped, waited, and allowed the interruption to fully register with the audience. That brief pause created an unexpected silence, one that subtly shifted attention away from Cruz's words and toward the act of interruption itself. When she resumed, she didn't attack him for it. She simply noted it and continued her point with composure intact. The effect was disarming. By not treating the interruption as an offense, she reframed it as unnecessary and revealing. Cruz, meanwhile, continued speaking as though nothing had happened, unaware that the balance had already shifted. The interruption exposed a dependence on dominance rather than dialogue, and once visible, it couldn't be unseen. Viewers could now track a pattern forming, even at this early stage. Each attempt by Cruz to seize control began to feel less like confidence and more like insecurity. The interruption also disrupted his own momentum. Instead of advancing his argument, he fractured it, forcing himself to circle back and repeat points that no longer carried the same weight. Crockett's response, calm and uninterrupted, made his earlier urgency seem misplaced. What was intended as a show of authority became the first clear signal that he was forcing the exchange into a shape it did not want to take. From that moment on, every subsequent interruption would be judged against this one, not as a tactic but as a tell. As the exchange progressed and his usual tactics failed to produce the desired reaction, Cruz shifted into a more overtly condescending mode. His tone slowed, his phrasing became exaggeratedly simple, and his delivery took on the cadence of a lecture rather than a debate. It was a deliberate attempt to reassert hierarchy, positioning himself as the adult in the room and Crockett as someone in need of correction. This rhetorical posture wasn't subtle. He emphasized basic points as if they were revelations, repeating them with slight variations, clearly expecting the audience to absorb his authority through repetition alone. But instead of reinforcing his dominance, the tactic exposed his discomfort. Condescension requires an audience willing to accept it, and Crockett's steady demeanor denied him that validation. She listened without visible frustration, which made his tone seem increasingly performative. The more he leaned into this approach, the more disconnected he appeared from the actual substance of the conversation. His explanations grew broader and less precise, trading specificity for attitude. That trade-off mattered, because it weakened the intellectual footing of his argument while amplifying its emotional edge. Viewers weren't being persuaded, they were being talked down to. Crockett's responses, by contrast, remained focused and clear, which only sharpened the contrast. She didn't challenge his tone directly, but she didn't accommodate it either. By responding as if his condescension were irrelevant, she stripped it of its intended effect. Cruz, sensing the imbalance, pressed harder, mistaking volume and emphasis for persuasion. Each elongated phrase and patronizing aside added another layer of distance between him and the audience. What he seemed to miss was that condescension without control reads as insecurity. Instead of elevating himself, he was narrowing his appeal, signaling that he had run out of ways to engage without diminishing the person across from him. When Jasmine Crockett finally took full control of the exchange, she did so with a level of precision that immediately reset the terms of the conversation. She didn't attempt to overpower Cruz or match his intensity. Instead, she narrowed the focus. Her responses were tightly structured, each sentence serving a specific purpose. She addressed what had actually been said, not what Cruz implied or gestured toward, and that discipline mattered. By grounding her remarks in clear context and verifiable detail, she quietly dismantled the broader narrative he had been trying to impose. There was no wasted language. Every clarification corrected a distortion, and every example anchored the discussion back to reality. This approach forced Cruz out of abstraction and into specifics, a space where his confidence noticeably thinned. Crockett's delivery was calm but firm, signaling that she wasn't reacting defensively but asserting ownership over the subject matter. The effect on the exchange was immediate. The audience no longer had to choose between competing tones. They could follow a coherent line of reasoning. Cruz's earlier condescension now appeared misplaced, even irrelevant, because she wasn't engaging him on an emotional level. She was methodically reframing the issue in front of him. Importantly, she didn't rush. She allowed her points to land, giving them space to register before moving on. That pacing conveyed command without theatrics. As she spoke, Cruz was forced into shorter interjections, less able to build momentum. The narrative had shifted from his attack to her explanation, and that shift was decisive. By prioritizing clarity over confrontation, Crockett didn't just respond to Cruz's argument. She replaced it with one that viewers could follow and evaluate on its own terms. As Crockett's control over the exchange solidified, the atmosphere in the studio subtly but unmistakably changed. The cues were small, almost imperceptible at first, but they accumulated quickly. The host's posture shifted, no longer leaning in to manage conflict, but allowing the conversation to breathe. Camera timing adjusted, lingering longer on Crockett as she spoke, signaling where the gravity of the moment now resided. Cruz's interjections, once expected and accommodated, began to feel intrusive rather than authoritative. The audience, both in the room and watching from home, could sense that the dynamic they were accustomed to had been disrupted. There was a growing awareness that this was no longer a controlled sparring match but an unfolding reversal. Crockett's steadiness created a center of gravity that the conversation orbited around, while Cruz's attempts to reclaim dominance felt increasingly out of sync. Even silence took on meaning. Brief pauses that might once have been filled with interruptions now hung in the air, emphasizing who was comfortable letting their words stand on their own. The rhythm of the exchange favored patience over force, and that rhythm worked against Cruz. Viewers are highly attuned to power shifts, even when they can't articulate them in the moment. They register confidence, coherence, and control intuitively. As Crockett spoke, those qualities accumulated around her, while Cruz's urgency began to read as strain. The studio didn't erupt or visibly react, but it didn't need to. The absence of chaos was itself a signal. What had begun as an attempted ambush now felt like a reckoning unfolding in slow motion. The audience wasn't waiting for a knockout line. They were watching the imbalance deepen, moment by moment, as one participant settled into command and the other struggled to keep pace. With the momentum clearly shifting away from him, Cruz reached for a familiar escape hatch: the gotcha question. The setup was deliberate, framed with loaded language and narrowed choices, designed to box Crockett into an answer that could be clipped, replayed, and weaponized. It was a move meant less to clarify than to trap, relying on speed and framing to manufacture advantage. In another setting, against a less disciplined opponent, it might have worked. But Crockett didn't rush to respond. She listened to the full question, recognized the premise it was trying to smuggle in, and refused to accept it as valid. Rather than choosing between the false options he presented, she stepped outside the frame entirely. She explained why the question itself distorted the issue, calmly unpacking the assumptions baked into it. That choice neutralized the trap before it could close. Cruz, expecting resistance within his framework, wasn't prepared for the framework to be rejected outright. The effect was jarring. His question, meant to sound incisive, suddenly appeared contrived. The audience could see the mechanics of the tactic exposed in real time. Crockett didn't accuse him of bad faith. She simply redirected the conversation toward accuracy. That restraint mattered. It kept the focus on substance rather than motive, making her response harder to dismiss. Cruz attempted to interject, but doing so only emphasized that his moment had slipped away. The gotcha had missed its target, and worse, it had rebounded. Instead of putting Crockett on the defensive, it highlighted his reliance on rhetorical shortcuts. The exchange revealed a growing asymmetry. She was engaging to explain, while he was maneuvering to score. Once that contrast became visible, the question no longer functioned as a weapon. It became evidence that his playbook was no longer effective in this setting. After dismantling the premise of Cruz's question, Crockett didn't simply move on. She redirected the energy of the moment with intention, turning the focus back toward Cruz himself. The shift was subtle but decisive. Instead of adopting an accusatory tone, she posed her own questions with measured clarity, grounding them in his public record and prior statements. This wasn't a counterattack designed for spectacle. It was an inversion of scrutiny. By asking rather than asserting, she placed Cruz in the position he had tried to force her into. The dynamic changed instantly. Cruz, who had been dictating terms, now had to respond within a framework he didn't control. Crockett's questions were precise, leaving little room for rhetorical evasion without appearing evasive. Each one narrowed the scope, pulling the conversation away from abstraction and toward accountability. Importantly, she didn't pile them on all at once. She allowed space between them, letting each implication register before continuing. That pacing mattered. It gave the audience time to process what was being asked and why it mattered. Cruz's responses grew shorter and less assured, revealing the discomfort of being examined under the same standards he had tried to impose. Crockett remained composed throughout, never signaling triumph or aggression. Her demeanor suggested that this was a natural extension of the conversation, not a reversal engineered for effect. That normalization made the role swap feel legitimate rather than performative. The audience could see that the conversation was now being driven by inquiry rather than accusation. Cruz attempted to broaden his answers, but the specificity of her questions kept pulling him back. In that moment, the power imbalance fully reversed. The exchange was no longer about defending against an attack. It was about responding to it. And Cruz, stripped of his usual framing advantages, struggled to regain footing. As the conversation slipped further out of his control, Cruz's physical demeanor began to tell a story his words could no longer manage. The relaxed posture he carried at the beginning tightened noticeably. His shoulders shifted forward, his movements became smaller and more restless, and his hands started to punctuate points with sharper, less measured gestures. These weren't conscious signals, they were involuntary reactions to pressure. He began speaking more quickly, compressing sentences as if racing against the conversation itself. Eye contact, once steady and performative, started to wander, alternating between the host, Crockett, and the camera in quick succession. That lack of focus subtly communicated uncertainty. Viewers might not consciously track these details, but they feel them. Body language registers before rhetoric does. Crockett, by contrast, remained physically still, reinforcing the contrast. Each time Cruz leaned in to interrupt or reclaim space, it only amplified the imbalance. His facial expressions shifted as well, cycling through forced smiles, tightened lips, and brief flashes of irritation that vanished as quickly as they appeared. These micro-expressions betrayed the effort it was taking to maintain composure. The confidence he projected earlier had relied on ease. Now everything about his presence suggested strain. Even moments of laughter felt out of place, arriving half a beat too late and fading too quickly. The more he tried to project control, the more his body contradicted him. This disconnect mattered because it undermined whatever authority his words were meant to convey. Authority depends on alignment between message and messenger, and that alignment was breaking down. Crockett didn't need to call attention to it. The camera did that work on its own. As the segment continued, Cruz's physical unease became part of the narrative, reinforcing the sense that the exchange had moved beyond his ability to manage it on his terms. As the exchange unfolded, it became increasingly clear that Cruz was no longer dictating the flow, and the facts themselves began to accumulate against him in real time. Crockett, deliberate in her pacing, layered each response with specific examples and documented details, building a chain of reasoning that left little room for ambiguity. Where Cruz relied on broad generalizations and rhetorical flourishes, she anchored her points in verifiable events, public records, and clear outcomes, creating a cumulative weight that could not be easily dismissed. Each example she offered wasn't isolated. It reinforced the next, establishing patterns rather than one-off moments. This stacking effect changed the perception of authority in the conversation. Cruz's earlier interruptions and condescending framing were gradually revealed as distractions from substance, and the audience began to perceive the gaps between his talking points and the reality she presented. The contrast became particularly striking when Cruz attempted to pivot back to ideology or abstract principles. While he relied on sweeping statements designed to rally partisan support, Crockett's responses remained grounded in tangible impact, making his framing feel disconnected and performative. Every fact she introduced acted like a counterweight, tilting the balance of credibility away from him. The more she spoke, the less Cruz could rely on repetition or theatrics to regain control. Attempts to interject were no longer effective because each fact she provided created a kind of structural scaffolding that anchored the conversation to reality rather than rhetoric. Her disciplined approach allowed the audience to follow a coherent narrative rather than a series of talking points, which made Cruz's strategic aggression appear increasingly hollow. Importantly, she didn't need to overstate her points or respond with visible frustration. Each fact landed on its own, leaving the burden on Cruz to address it, and he increasingly failed to do so in a coherent manner. As the evidence mounted, the tension in the exchange shifted from a rhetorical battle to a demonstration of accountability, making it apparent who was commanding the conversation and who was struggling to maintain control. By systematically layering context, examples, and concrete data, Crockett transformed what might have been a fleeting clash into a cumulative, inescapable pattern that left Cruz on the defensive for the remainder of the segment, illustrating a decisive reversal of power that unfolded live before viewers' eyes. Recognizing that his specific arguments were faltering under Crockett's methodical dismantling, Cruz attempted a familiar maneuver. He pivoted to ideology, hoping to reframe the conversation in terms that might resonate with his base rather than confront the substance of her points. He invoked broad partisan principles, relying on familiar talking points about limited government, traditional values, and conservative priorities. The pivot was designed to shift the conversation away from the concrete examples Crockett had layered in and back toward abstractions where he might feel more comfortable. On paper, this approach could have regained control. Ideology often functions as a rallying banner for supporters and a shield against granular scrutiny. In practice, however, the transition was abrupt and unanchored. It lacked continuity with the issues already being discussed, making it feel more like a deflection than a pivot. Crockett immediately recognized the move and refused to let the narrative drift into abstraction. She brought the discussion back to tangible outcomes and real-world consequences, asking how these ideological positions translated into policy that affected people's lives. Her insistence on specificity exposed a gap between Cruz's rhetoric and actionable reality. Each time he tried to expand on his ideological framing, she pulled it back into the domain of accountability, forcing him to defend the real-world implications rather than the slogans. The audience could perceive the dissonance. Cruz was offering generalities, while Crockett was presenting grounded, evidence-based points. The contrast reinforced the earlier power shift. Ideology without connection to practical outcomes began to feel hollow, even performative, highlighting the strain in Cruz's attempts to dominate the conversation. His tone, previously confident and assertive, now carried a hint of urgency, suggesting he recognized the pivot wasn't gaining traction. Meanwhile, Crockett's composure remained intact, her focus unshaken, allowing the audience to track both the shift in strategy and its failure in real time. Each attempted ideological flourish was met with a calm, methodical redirect, demonstrating that while Cruz relied on repetition and familiar tropes, Crockett relied on substance, coherence, and precision. By attempting to pivot to ideology, Cruz revealed the limits of his approach. When the conversation demanded specificity and accountability, sweeping generalizations could no longer carry him, leaving him increasingly exposed and reinforcing the perception that control had left his hands entirely. As Cruz attempted to elevate the discussion into ideological abstraction, Crockett skillfully pulled it back into the concrete realities that actually mattered to the audience. She framed her responses around tangible consequences and real-world impacts, shifting attention from abstract principles to measurable outcomes. Every point she made was anchored in lived experience, whether through policy implications, community effects, or empirical data that illustrated the consequences of political decisions. By doing this, she reframed the conversation in a way that forced Cruz to engage with specifics rather than rely on generalized talking points or partisan slogans. This grounding strategy not only highlighted the gap between his rhetoric and reality, but also reinforced her own credibility, demonstrating command of the subject without needing to resort to theatrics or aggression. Crockett's timing and pacing amplified this effect. She delivered her points deliberately, giving the audience time to absorb each example before moving on to the next, creating a rhythm that emphasized thoughtfulness over haste. Each tangible example she provided further exposed the insufficiency of Cruz's ideological pivot, as abstract language alone could not adequately address the real-world scenarios she presented. The contrast became increasingly stark. While Cruz offered sweeping statements designed to inspire alignment with an ideology, Crockett delivered grounded, fact-based analysis that demanded accountability and critical engagement. Her calm, deliberate tone conveyed authority without confrontation, making it clear that she was not reacting to him, but rather steering the discussion according to the principles of clarity and reality. By keeping the debate anchored in concrete facts, she created a lens through which viewers could evaluate each claim on its merits, rather than being swayed by style or bravado. This strategy also neutralized many of Cruz's attempts to dominate the narrative, as his rhetorical flourishes became less persuasive against clear, verifiable outcomes. Gradually, the framing of the conversation shifted. Viewers were no longer watching a scripted confrontation, but a substantive exchange where the weight of evidence and reality dictated the terms. Crockett's methodical grounding of the debate effectively forced Cruz to confront the consequences of his positions and, in doing so, further eroded his authority, making it increasingly clear who was in control of the discussion and whose arguments carried the weight of reality rather than performance. As the tension in the exchange mounted, it became evident that even the host's subtle interventions could no longer steer the balance back toward Cruz. Early in the segment, the host had provided the usual scaffolding: brief transitions, clarifying questions, and light moderation designed to keep the conversation moving and prevent either participant from dominating the airtime entirely. These interventions are typically sufficient to give a seasoned debater like Cruz opportunities to regain control or at least preserve the perception of command. In this case, however, they failed. Each attempt by the host to reset the discussion or refocus the segment only highlighted Cruz's growing inability to respond effectively. The questions intended to smooth the flow instead exposed the gaps in his arguments, as Crockett's measured responses consistently reframed the issues with clarity and precision. She absorbed the host's interventions seamlessly, using them to strengthen her points rather than being pushed off topic. Cruz, by contrast, found himself increasingly reactive. His timing faltered, and his attempts to pivot back to prepared lines of attack became more strained and noticeable. Every interjection from the host, instead of providing relief, emphasized the contrast between Crockett's composure and his mounting urgency. The audience could perceive this shift intuitively. In a live television environment, viewers read these cues quickly. Someone struggling to respond while another remains poised signals a reversal of authority, regardless of the content being discussed. By the middle of the segment, the host's influence was largely neutralized. The structure of the show, which normally serves as a stabilizing framework, had become a stage upon which Cruz's vulnerabilities were amplified. Crockett, unaffected by external pacing or guidance, dictated the rhythm and focus, turning every attempt to reassert control into another example of Cruz's faltering performance. The host could ask clarifying questions, provide segues, or attempt to redirect. But these tools, when wielded against someone with calm precision like Crockett, only underscored her command. The cumulative effect was unmistakable. The usual safety net that anchors live exchanges no longer functioned, leaving Cruz exposed. The segment structure, typically an ally to established personalities, now served as a silent amplifier of the imbalance, reinforcing the narrative that control had shifted irreversibly into Crockett's hands, while Cruz struggled to regain footing under the relentless clarity of her approach. By the time Cruz attempted another interruption, the dynamic of the exchange had shifted so dramatically that even a move he had relied on for years now worked against him. His interruption was sharper, delivered with more urgency, as if trying to reclaim a fleeting sense of control. He spoke over Crockett mid-sentence, raising his voice slightly and gesturing to emphasize his point, expecting the familiar effect, that the audience would perceive him as authoritative, decisive, and in command. Instead, the interruption immediately highlighted his desperation. Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice, roll her eyes, or otherwise react in the way that would have reinforced the intended narrative. By remaining composed, she rendered the interruption ineffective and, in fact, turned it into evidence of his loss of control. The contrast between his heightened aggression and her calm precision was stark. Every gesture, every hastily interjected sentence, reinforced the perception that he was struggling to regain a conversation slipping away from him. The interruption also disrupted his own rhythm. In trying to cut her off, he forfeited the opportunity to make a coherent point, leaving him fragmented mid-argument while she retained control of the floor. The audience, both in the studio and watching remotely, registered this imbalance intuitively. In live television, control isn't just about speaking. It's about being heard and setting the narrative pace. Crockett's silence in the face of his aggression amplified the tension, allowing viewers to process the disparity in composure and command. Each failed attempt to dominate visually reinforced her steady authority. The more he interrupted, the more the strategy backfired, transforming a tactic that was supposed to demonstrate confidence into a clear sign of faltering influence. By the end of this exchange, what should have been a simple tool for disruption had instead become a public illustration of his diminishing control, further shifting audience perception and solidifying Crockett's dominance in real time. His repeated interruption underscored the growing asymmetry. Where she responded with discipline and clarity, he acted reactively, allowing his body language, tone, and timing to betray the unraveling of his intended narrative. The turning point arrived with a moment of remarkable clarity, delivered not with volume or theatricality, but with precise articulation that reframed the entire exchange. Crockett had been patiently building her narrative, stacking facts, examples, and context in a way that gradually undermined Cruz's attempts to dominate. Then, she crystallized everything into a single, unassailable point that cut through the noise. Without raising her voice or gesturing dramatically, she distilled the argument to its essence, framing Cruz's attacks not as substantive critiques but as deflections from accountability. The brilliance of the moment was in its simplicity. Rather than engaging in prolonged back and forth, she highlighted the contradiction between his rhetoric and his record, exposing a gap that could not be ignored. Cruz attempted to interject as he had done throughout the segment, but this time it was too late. The narrative pivoted entirely under her control. The audience immediately recognized the shift. What had begun as a conventional confrontation, with him attacking and her defending, was now a demonstration of mastery in live debate. Every earlier interruption, condescending remark, and ideological pivot was rendered secondary to this pivot in perception. Crockett's calm, methodical delivery amplified the effect. She didn't need to shout to dominate the frame. The turning point also shifted the emotional tenor of the segment. Viewers who had been following with anticipation now felt a mix of surprise and validation, witnessing a calculated attack unravel before their eyes. Cruz's usual tools, repetition, assertive tone, and rehearsed framing, had no purchase against this clarity. By reducing the exchange to a precise, defensible, and reality-based point, she forced him onto the defensive in a way that was both undeniable and undeniable in its elegance. This moment became the fulcrum of the entire segment. It reframed the story for the audience, setting up the final phase of the exchange where every subsequent move he made would be measured against this turning point. From that instant, it was clear who controlled the narrative, whose arguments carried substance, and whose attempts to dominate the conversation had failed in real time, leaving Cruz visibly unmoored and viewers captivated by the reversal. Following Crockett's decisive turning point, Cruz found himself on unfamiliar terrain, struggling to formulate a coherent response. The momentum she had created left him reacting rather than leading, and each word he attempted to deploy seemed increasingly calculated and constrained. His usual confidence, the hallmark of his public persona, faltered under the weight of her precision and composure. Instead of advancing a clear point, he circled back to earlier arguments, repeating phrases and claims that had already been dismantled in front of the audience. The repetition, which in another context might reinforce a position, here highlighted a lack of adaptability. His sentences grew fragmented, the flow interrupted by pauses and stammered connectors, betraying the cognitive effort required just to maintain footing. Meanwhile, Crockett maintained steady eye contact, her body language calm and deliberate, signaling that she was neither rushed nor rattled. The contrast amplified the perception that Cruz was struggling. He attempted to pivot, reaching for ideological framing or hypothetical scenarios, but Crockett's insistence on grounded, real-world context nullified those efforts. Each time he tried to redirect, she gently but firmly brought the focus back to concrete evidence, subtly cornering him into defending specifics rather than abstractions. The audience could perceive the strain without needing explicit commentary. Visual cues like shifting posture, tighter gestures, and brief flashes of irritation communicated more than words could. His voice, previously measured and assertive, now carried tension and urgency, further signaling discomfort. Attempting to interject or cut her off only compounded the impression of a reactive participant struggling to regain control. Every hesitation, every repeated point, and every failed pivot reinforced the narrative of a reversal in power. While Cruz tried to salvage authority through pacing and vocal emphasis, the strategy backfired. It highlighted the disparity between his preparation and his present effectiveness. The longer he struggled, the more Crockett's calm command became the defining feature of the exchange. By the end of this phase, it was clear to viewers that the momentum had shifted decisively, with Crockett dictating the terms of engagement and Cruz forced into defensive improvisation, unable to reclaim the narrative or the frame that had dominated his earlier public interactions. As the segment drew to a close, the formal exchange technically ended, but the consequences of what had just unfolded were already fully apparent. Cruz attempted a closing statement, aiming to reassert control and leave viewers with a final impression of authority. His words were measured and familiar, structured to provide a sense of composure after a chaotic segment, yet they landed flat. The audience, now fully attuned to the earlier dynamics, no longer focused on his phrasing or delivery. Instead, they replayed the moments where his attacks had faltered, his interruptions had failed, and his attempts to pivot had been neutralized. Every misstep and every hesitation crystallized into a narrative that could not be undone. Crockett, on the other hand, remained composed until the very end. Her posture, tone, and clarity never wavered, reinforcing the cumulative impression that she had maintained command throughout the exchange. The contrast was stark and unavoidable. One participant had tried repeatedly to dominate, while the other had consistently grounded the conversation in reality, clarity, and accountability. By the time the cameras cut, viewers had witnessed a shift in power that went beyond the momentary spectacle of a debate. Cruz's usual tools, repetition, ideology, assertive interruptions, had failed, and the visual and verbal record made it impossible to recover the narrative he had intended. Social media, in the immediate aftermath, would amplify the segment's pivotal moments, replaying interruptions, failed pivots, and Crockett's decisive reframing. The damage was not just in lost rhetorical control. It was in perception. Audiences could see a pattern emerge. A public figure, accustomed to managing live exchanges through force and pre-scripted framing, being consistently outmaneuvered in real time by a calm, disciplined opponent. That perception would linger far longer than any single soundbite, shaping how viewers processed not only this particular segment but Cruz's broader credibility and command. By the end, the exchange was less a debate than a demonstration. The arc of authority had clearly shifted, and the lasting impression was that Crockett had dictated both the terms and the outcome, leaving Cruz visibly unmoored and the audience fully aware of the reversal that had taken place in front of their eyes. Long after the cameras stopped rolling, the impact of the exchange continued to reverberate, and for Cruz, it followed him far beyond the immediate broadcast. What made this moment so consequential wasn't a single line, a raised voice, or a viral soundbite. It was the cumulative effect of an entire segment in which his usual strategies failed repeatedly under live scrutiny. Each failed interruption, every attempt to pivot to ideology, and each moment where his condescension fell flat had been recorded in real time, creating a visual and narrative record that could not easily be reframed or forgotten. Viewers and commentators replayed those moments across social media, analyzing his timing, tone, and body language alongside Crockett's calm, disciplined presence. Unlike scripted campaigns or staged appearances, this exchange offered an unfiltered window into how he handled sustained, precise accountability. It revealed vulnerabilities in his performance, showing him reactive, strained, and struggling to maintain authority against a methodical and composed opponent. The power of the moment extended beyond the content of the debate itself because it demonstrated a larger pattern. A public figure accustomed to controlling conversations, dominating frames, and scripting outcomes being consistently outmaneuvered in a live setting by a challenger who refused to play by those rules. Every interruption, misstep, and hesitation became a piece of evidence that circulated independently of partisan interpretation, allowing audiences to witness a reversal of power that felt undeniable. The viral circulation of the clip reinforced its significance, framing Cruz's performance as an instructive example of what happens when preparation and confidence are insufficient to meet the demands of real-time accountability. Analysts and commentators dissected the segment, highlighting how Crockett's composure and grounding in reality exposed the fragility of his rhetorical tactics, further cementing the narrative in public consciousness. Beyond perception, the moment carried political implications. It created a reference point for opponents and supporters alike, shaping expectations for future appearances and setting a standard for how Crockett's approach could redefine live debate dynamics. For Cruz, the memory of the exchange could not simply be erased. It became a benchmark against which future public interactions were measured, a reminder that carefully crafted messaging can unravel when confronted with disciplined clarity and factual rigor. The exchange's resonance endured because it wasn't just an isolated gaffe. It was a systematic unraveling captured in full view of an engaged, critical audience. Each subsequent discussion about Cruz inevitably referenced the segment, turning what was meant to be a moment of dominance into a lasting example of a power shift and a lesson in how public perception is shaped when control is lost on live television. The impact lingered because viewers had witnessed the reversal unfold organically, making it impossible to dismiss, and transforming a single broadcast into a defining moment that trailed him long after the lights went out.